We have some big breaking news in the Russia investigation that we're following right now and continuing to parse through at this moment. We're told the memorandum is out for Paul Manafort. This could be Mueller's most detailed court filing to date. We'll bring you more details as soon as they become available, but we are looking it over right now. So all of this comes as the Justice Department took the unusual step discussing the timing of the Mueller report, saying it will not be delivered next week as previously reported. Some mysterious timing here at play. Joining me now, NBC's White House correspondent Jeff Bennett, Ned Price, MSNBC national security analyst and former National Security Council spokesman for President Obama, and Greg Bauer, who is a former U.S. attorney and assistant director for the Office of Congressional Affairs at the FBI. As we mentioned, this is a big breaking news story. We're still trying to parse through this document. There are some hundreds and hundreds of pages right now through all of this, and we'll get to you guys in a moment, but I want to bring in my colleague right now who has been paying attention to all of this, Jeff Bennett. Jeff, what are you learning? All right.
Candace, was that question for me, or
yeah,
do you have...
apologies, Jeff.
Okay, I thought you had. I thought you might have had Tom Winter on the phone. So here's what we know. This is the reporting from our colleague Tom Winter, who is part of NBC News' investigative unit. He says that federal prosecutors have filed an 800-page court filing sentencing memo for Paul Manafort. This was expected overnight. There was a midnight Friday deadline, but it was not publicly released. Now, as you mentioned, it's 800 pages with attachments. This is not some easy Saturday reading, so our team is combing through it right now. The reason why this sentencing memo matters is because it could provide some indication of where the special counsel team is headed next. We know that the federal prosecutors say that Paul Manafort's relationship with a business associate who is alleged to have ties to Russian intelligence named Konstantin Kilimnik goes to the heart of what the special counsel is investigating. So this document that has been made public, which of course will have redactions, whatever we can parse from it, whatever we can read from it to get a sense of what this relationship was, what this connection was between Manafort and Kilimnik and how it might have influenced the campaign. If there's a link between the Russians and President Trump, that, of course, is what the special counsel is investigating. So that is what we are hoping to learn more from this document, Kendra.
And this is something that was highly anticipated. We stayed up much of last night anticipating it on a Friday night. Last time I did that was waiting for Beyonce at Coachella. But why was this such an important document for so many people, Ned?
Well, it's such an important document for especially Mr. Manafort because, one, it could hold the keys to his future. In going through this very briefly, you may be surprised to hear I haven't had a chance to go through all 850 pages.
All 850 pages
in the 6 or 7 minutes it's been out. But the special counsel's office essentially says that they're taking no position on the precise sentence that Mr. Manafort should receive for his crimes. They reserve the right to come back to that after he's sentenced in a separate court proceeding.
And when you hear that right there, that's interesting. Many people were speculating that because he possibly broke his non-prosecution agreement or his deal with the prosecutors there, they expected that Mueller's office would say, put him in jail for the rest of his life.
Well, they say that, Candace, in not so many words in one way. The summary says that Mr. Manafort conducted many aggravating factors and no mitigating factors. So what essentially they're saying is, look, this guy, at least in our estimation, shouldn't get any leniency. It goes on to say that he repeatedly and brazenly conducted criminal activity over the course of more than a decade, and even says that criminal activity, that criminal conduct, didn't abate after he was indicted last year. So it's a pretty broad condemnation of Paul Manafort's activities just looking at those summary paragraphs there.
And Greg, in the meantime, you're looking at it as well. And I know that's very early in the stages and you have some 850 pages there in all of this. But once again, the importance of this document when prosecutors file certain information like this.
Yeah, I haven't made it past page 1, to be honest.
As an attorney, what's the importance of something like this?
Well,
what do we look for?
Sure, I'll focus on the redactions. The fact that this document is redacted, I don't know how heavily, but let's assume heavily redacted, which I would expect. That, in the ordinary course, would suggest that this is an investigation that is very much ongoing. And as a result, the government with the court's permission, is not willing to reveal every piece of information that is relevant to the Manafort sentencing. And that could mean that further indictments are coming. We just don't know. But typically, when the government can't reveal everything, that means it's still working on the investigation and further indictments are coming.
And Jeff, with that said, NBC reporting has been that we expected the Mueller report to come around this time. Of course, the special counsel's office just about 24 hours ago took the unusual step of saying, no, it is not going to be delivered to the new attorney general by the end of next week. You see this document, and as you heard there from Greg, many of the 850 pages are redacted, and think of the timeline and frame here, and you think, what? This investigation is nowhere near an end.
Right. I think the old rule applies here. Only the special counsel knows what the special counsel knows. I mean, if this report were to drop sometime next week, of course, that would create this split screen. You have the president overseas in Vietnam with his second summit with Kim Jong-un, while this report would be on the desk of Bill Barr. And of course, Democrats have already made clear their demand that they want him to make that report public. Of course, there is no requirement, no obligation for him to do so. So yes, the senior Justice Department official telling NBC News that the reporting from many outlets on this is wrong, that this report will not drop anytime next week. Of course, the president does still have to contend with the fact that Michael Cohen, his longtime lawyer and fixer, will be on Capitol Hill for a marathon appearance. He has 3 hearings scheduled next week on the Hill, one of which is behind closed doors. So yes, the president in many ways still has to deal with the fallout of this Russia question. And with Michael Cohen, or with Cohen, of course, it's the issue of his former business practices.
And Ned, dive into for me right now the Manhattan District Attorney's moves that they're making right there. New York Times reporting that they are looking into possibly filing some charges against Paul Manafort, and many people are saying that's just in case and to protect the investigation, just in case he should get a pardon out of this situation. You see what you've parsed of that first page of this 850-page document from the special counsel's office today, and know that there's possibility that there might be other charges that may be on the way, and see what the special counsel said today, and you think, is it possible that there's still a little bit of talking that might be happening?
Well, it's certainly possible, and I think you look at the court proceedings in recent weeks for Paul Manafort, and that seems to be a concern on the part of federal prosecutors. In court the other week, Andrew Weissman, one of the lead prosecutors, made the point that Paul Manafort had lied, and at the heart of that was the question of why he had lied. In other words, the motive behind that. And in one way, that court proceeding could be read to infer that motive was what was at the heart of the Mueller investigation, that the underlying crimes, at least in one reading, were so horrific and horrendous that being truthful and candid and honest about them would in some ways terminate the chances for his pardon, something that Paul Manafort has clearly been gunning for ever since he came under legal scrutiny. Remember that his lawyers continued to talk to President Trump's lawyers even after Paul Manafort was behind bars, trying to be seen as a helpful player, presumably for President Trump. What prosecutors in New York have done, according to this New York Times report at least, is to secure what they might call an insurance policy, just in case President Trump decides to pardon Paul Manafort for these federal crimes, that they would still have something in the hopper, something at the state level that they could charge him with that doesn't run afoul of the state's double jeopardy laws.
That indeed. Okay, so I just want to remind everybody of the breaking news that we're following right now at this hour at 2:27 p.m. Eastern Time. Might be a Saturday, but it's a working day for the courts, at least there in D.C. Federal prosecutors are filing an 800-plus page sentencing memo for Paul Manafort involving his cases there in D.C. Just a little bit of what we're reading right now from it. Here's what it says. Consistent with the practice the special counsel's office has followed, the government does not take a position with respect to a particular sentence to be imposed. Instead, the government sets forth its assessment of the nature of the offenses and offender and the applicable advisory sentencing guidelines and sentencing factors. And so, Ned, you picked up on that. Greg, you listened to that. And so they're not necessarily laying it out there how much time they would like for him to spend in jail. So what does that kind of give you a sense of, that he might be cooperating?
Well, I don't know that in and of itself would give us that sense. Look, any way that you slice it, between the two cases, the one in EDVA and the one in D.C., Manafort is looking at, at age 69, he's looking at effectively, and unfortunately for him, a life sentence, at least 10 years in prison. And so it does beg the question, once again, why hasn't he cooperated in an effort to reduce his sentence? As was mentioned earlier, he seems to be counting on a pardon. That is a dicey proposition, and one that, of course, he can't really control at all. And so at this point, it appears that he's continuing to not cooperate. But, of course, that could change. With most defendants, no matter how steadfast they may be at the early stages of their prosecution, about not cooperating, not talking, most defendants eventually, when facing the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, do end up cooperating. We'll see if Manafort is one of those. All
right, gentlemen, hang on there for a moment. We want to bring in Tom Winter, NBC News investigations reporter, who joins us now on the phone. Tom has been doing some speed reading. Tom, what stands out to you right now?
Well, I think is the special counsel throughout this entire process has never recommended a specific sentence, unless they've asked for a downward revision or they've pointed out somebody's cooperation in their efforts. So what has happened here today is they've kept up with their practice. They've been consistent with their practice. But what they do note in the filing is that the sentencing guidelines, so this is the typical guidelines that the court uses based on all sorts of factors that come into play with specific crimes that somebody's committed. They say essentially those guidelines call for a little over 17 years to almost 22 years in jail. They say that they're not going to take a position as to whether or not the jail time in the D.C. case, which is what we're talking about here today, whether or not that time should be tacked on to the end of the sentence that's imposed in the Virginia case, or whether it should be served at the same time, basically, so he could be serving his time for both the D.C. and the Virginia case all together. So,
and Tom, they did not specify on that one? I lost you there. They did not specify on whether they would like it to be served concurrently?
That's correct. They did not specify that. They say that they want to wait to see what the sentence is imposed in Virginia, and then they can, at sentencing, they'll make a determination whether or not they want to say, well, we should tack on the D.C. years to the Virginia case, or hey, they can serve them all at once. If your guest, and I'm sorry I didn't hear who it was just before, noted, for Paul Manafort here, he's 69 years old. If he gets the sentence that is within the guidelines in the Virginia case, that could effectively be a life sentence. So they may just say, well, he can serve that time while he's serving the D.C. time, or vice versa, I should say. So at this point, for folks that we're hoping for, and we're still going through this, so I want to be clear, this is very preliminary, just going through it. For folks that saw the 800 pages filed and saw that there were going to be redactions, thinking that we might learn more about Paul Manafort's behavior here, what he might have been up to, we're not getting that. Most of the 800 pages that were filed as attachments are already public-facing documents. So in other words, it's his plea agreement, it's the statement of offense, it's exhibit list, it's information from the Virginia case that we've already seen and has already been made public. So that's not exactly 800 pages of Paul Manafort's interviews, for instance. So we're not going to learn a lot more about his behavior here today. There's a very detailed narrative as far as what Paul Manafort has been up to in his business practices abroad, his lobbying efforts on behalf of Ukraine, but most of that information has already been well reported. So there's really not much new here. As far as redactions, people were looking into this as the redactions maybe being an indication that the investigation is still ongoing, that it's not close to being wrapped up. I think that's not the case based upon my preliminary reading of the documents, because most of the redactions have to do with a dispute involving the pre-sentence report. That's something that we normally never see, and it's a look from the probation department, and it's basically a deep dive into a defendant's character. So that's not something that we ever see, and if there's a dispute about it, that's not something that they can or should put on the public record, and it really doesn't tell us much more about Paul Manafort's crime. So that's an important thing to note. Other redactions that we've seen are redactions that, frankly, I would expect. The redactions that have to do with people's names that, for instance, congressmen that were lobbied as part of Paul Manafort's Ukraine work. Those congressmen are not alleged to have done any wrongdoing. They just were hearing out a specific lobbying effort. So the fact that we don't see those names or sections are redacted doesn't strike me as anything unusual and doesn't indicate to me that there's some broader, big, ongoing investigation here that is somehow being protected. So
Tom,
that's my quick read of it.
Yeah, you were saying
I'd like an opportunity to read a little bit more, but that's kind of the thing.
But really quickly, while you hang in there for a moment there, you were saying that there were some things about it that made you, indicated to you that the Mueller is not near wrapping up.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Were there certain things that you read into this 25 to 800 page document based on some attachments to it that made you say that Mueller is not near wrapping up his...
No. I said, as a matter of fact, it's quite the opposite.
Okay.
It indicates to me, based on how much they have disclosed in this and what the documents actually are, that there's no indication here that there's some broader ongoing investigation or that for somehow all the information that we've heard that this investigation is quickly winding down is not correct. To me, based upon the filing and the redactions that I've seen, they have nothing really to do with an ongoing investigation, so there's no indication to me. Again, we're still pouring through this. It's a lot of pages.
Yeah.
There's no indication to me that strikes out on the first read is any sort of ongoing investigation that's still being protected here.
All right. We'll have Tom continue to read through this document. I have a copy of it right here in the studio. It is 25 pages long in essence, as you can see right here. But there are some 800 pages as part of attachments and such. A lot of it is redacted, as we mentioned. One little thing of note on that first page right there that Price also read through, it said, based on his relevant sentencing conduct, Manafort presents many aggravating sentencing factors and no warranted mitigating factors. Manafort committed an array of felonies for over a decade, up through the fall of 2018. Manafort chose repeatedly and knowingly to violate the law. Some other headlines, Ned, that we're finding out from this. The special counsel's office says for over a decade, Paul Manafort repeatedly and brazenly violated the law, and they say his behavior remarkably went unabated even after his indictment. It does seem a little damning, this sentencing memo, even though they do not put any sort of guidelines out there as for how much time he should get.
Yeah, Candace, to echo what Tom was saying, and again, I have not even come near to reading through this whole thing, but it doesn't seem like we're learning a whole lot more about the underlying acts, the criminal activity here. But what is most striking to me in my initial cursory read of this is the assessment on the part of the special counsel's team of Paul Manafort's character. And we've read some of those assessments, but here's another one. That it says that Manafort's conduct reflects a hardened adherence to committing crimes and lack of remorse. And that's pretty blunt and pretty brutal, especially when you consider this is someone who has floated at the top of Republican circles for years, if not decades, to include chairing the campaign of the current Republican president. And I think that is really telling, this assessment of who Paul Manafort is, what he has done, and in turn, the sort of punishment he merits, his conduct merits from our federal penal system. I think it's pretty remarkable, the sort of language that's in here.
And to continue on that note right there, another part of it that stood out to me says, like, the prosecutors sounded befuddled when they said, noting nothing about Manafort's upbringing, schooling, legal education, or family and financial circumstances mitigates his criminality. In essence, they're saying that it came along, if his alleged criminality came along some years later. Our NBC's intelligence and national security reporter, Ken Delanian, joins us right now on the phone as well with more on this memo. Ken, I'm sure you've scanned through a lot of it. What stands out to you right now?
Well, importantly, the fact that the word Russia does not appear in the 25 pages, as far as I can tell, and the only mention of the word conspiracy is in connection to the Manafort crimes we already know about. I think we have to really level with our viewers here, and I just want to emphasize what Tom Winter told us before. It's my assessment, too. This document does not allude to any involvement by Paul Manafort in any kind of conspiracy with the Russian election interference, which was the main crime that Robert Mueller, or the main allegation that Robert Mueller was tasked to investigate. And that's what a lot of people were looking at from this document. And there were some hints in the other documents and the transcripts of sealed hearings that we've seen as to what Manafort lied about in his relationship with a man named Konstantin Kilimnik, who is believed by the FBI to be an asset of Russian intelligence. None of that is in here. Now, I think you have Greg Brower, former U.S. attorney, with you. Maybe he can speak to this, but it seems unlikely to me that Robert Mueller has evidence of other crimes on Manafort's behalf and just doesn't mention them at all in a final sentencing document going before the judge.
Greg, I'm not sure if you can hear Ken Delaney and what he was saying just now. Care to weigh in?
Yeah, I did hear, and I'm on set here, so I don't have the benefit of having been able to finish reading the document, but I think Tom's reporting and Ken's as well is very important. If these redactions are simply the ordinary sorts of redactions that would be in such a document, then that's one thing, and that's what it appears to be. That does not suggest, would not suggest that the special counsel is trying to keep from the public information relating to an ongoing investigation. And so if the redactions are simply that, then I would agree that this document would not suggest that there is more to come with respect to perhaps a Manafort-Russia connection or further indictments. That may be the case. Those indictments may be coming, but I don't think that this document can be fairly read to suggest that.
So, Ken, as you're reading it through, are you kind of getting a sense that at the end of the day, you're reporting saying that Mueller may be close to wrapping up his investigation, and after parsing through this document that features Paul Manafort, the chairman, the former chairman of the Trump campaign, kind of get a sense that the Mueller might be coming up empty when it comes to collusion or anything else, or is that too far to glean?
You know, you can't reach these kinds of conclusions. You do so at your peril. But it is a possibility. You have to entertain that possibility when you see a document like this describing a lot of criminality, a decades-long criminal scheme, but stuff we already knew about from Manafort's trial, and no reference to any kind of Russia conspiracy. And if anyone would have been involved in a Russia conspiracy in the Trump campaign, you would think it would have been Paul Manafort, the man who had all these Russia connections. And again, you know, clearly Mueller has evidence that we are not aware of. We saw hints of that in the sealed transcripts, some of which were still redacted. But to have no mention of it in a final sentencing document suggests that he either doesn't have the evidence, or some people still believe he's holding his fire, he's keeping it secret for his own reasons. But, you know, he has flipped not only Paul Manafort, but Michael Cohen, who is Donald Trump's longtime lawyer and fixer, Mike Flynn, the national security advisor, yet none of them have been charged, and no allusion has been made in court papers to their role in any kind of conspiracy with Russia. And I think after 2 years of this investigation, we have to start paying heed to that and preparing ourselves for the possibility that, yes, in fact, Robert Mueller does not have that evidence.